And welcome back to Security and Compliance Weekly. It's time for our News of the Week segment. But first, let me give you a couple announcements. In the Security Weekly network, it's time for our annual listener survey. This is when you have the opportunity to give us feedback, what you like, what you don't like, and suggestions, anything you want to give us. If you want to participate, you can help shape the future of our programming and provide us feedback. Visit securityweekly.com. Select the survey in the menu tab and click on Listener Survey. Fill it out, and we're really looking forward to getting your information. We also have exciting news about the Security Weekly webcast program. We're now partnered with ISC Squared as an official CPE provider. If you attend any of our webcasts, you will be receiving 1 CPE credit per webcast. You register for one of our upcoming webcasts with Bryce Schroeder and Barbara Kay of ServiceNow or Steve Lobenstein of Core Security by going to securityweekly.com/webcast. If you've missed any of our previously recorded webcasts, you can find our on-demand library at securityweekly.com/on-demand. So
and
if I understand,
and they get CPE credits
even if you listen to the archive version.
Yes. So you can go back, look at the on-demands, watch those. As long as we have your ISC Squared number, we will submit that information to ISC Squared to give you CPE credits.
So basically,
even
you
for
register with your ISC Squared number, and this is required for what kind of certification? Because I don't have any.
CISSP and all the other ISC Squared certifications.
So if you're an assessor and you need to get your CPE credits, you can knock off a bunch by coming to our website and listening to our webcast.
Yeah, I think there's like 28 on the on-demand library right now. Sweet. Plus, there's always new ones. We do 1 to 2 a month. Based on the different times of the year. So people can register, watch them live. We live stream those. It's usually Paul and I sitting over there in the corner. Or you go to the on-demand library.
Do you have to register in order to be able to access the archive?
Correct. Yeah, okay. You have to register for all of them, both the live and the on-demands.
Great. So if you're looking for CPE credits, this is a great resource. And usually they're very informative, educational, and maybe a little bit fun too. So not your typical way of earning a CPE credit.
Correct. There's always a drink and cigar in hand on a webcast.
If you're the type of person that has to go out and get certification, which I don't. So it's all alien to me.
Lucky for you.
So anyway, news of the week. Guys, is there any news stories you want to focus on?
Well, we were talking PCI, so we figured why not start with how PCI can help you with GDPR compliance.
So that's an interesting topic because we did talk in our first segment about some of the overlap that exists, or companies that have to not only deal with PCI but they have to deal with other regulatory compliance requirements. And GDPR certainly has reared its ugly head in the last year or so.
It's a good idea to a certain extent. Yep. The idea that personal data is your data and you should know what's going on with it is the same idea behind PCI DSS. Your credit card data is your data, and you should know what's going on with it, or it should be handled properly at the very least. You give explicit consent to somebody to take your credit card. You have to give them your credit card or your credit card data over the phone and a website, whatever, for them to have your credit card data. If I'm going to have somebody collect my personal data, my name, my address, my social security number, whatever, they should have to say, oh, we're going to process it this way. When I buy something using PCI data, credit card data, I'm buying, whatever. I'm buying this phone using my credit card data. Okay, so I give them explicit consent to do one specific thing with it. Why shouldn't we have the same thing for our personal data? Yeah. So for that, GDPR makes sense. And for that concept and that mindset, that's how they really interact well.
So I think what's interesting in this article is you take the core requirements of PCI DSS, but instead of applying it to the card data environment, you now apply those same controls to your personal data or to the personal data, right? So what you've done is you've expanded the scope of PCI beyond the cardholder data now to personal data, email, and all the other PII components. And what this article is saying is, look, if you use the tenets of PCI DSS, which you've talked about a lot, which is why we gave you your own show, It can be applied.
Or you put me off in a corner.
Every time it says PCI.
You still get to come on PSW. So, we're not going to hear the end of PCI and drinking.
We're still going to be drinking.
Exactly. But what this article says is, look, apply those same goals, those same types of controls, but now apply that to all the personal data you're storing. It's a really good measuring stick for how you should approach GDPR. And we'll talk about the California requirement a little later in the segment on news, because it's coming to the U.S. very soon.
So when you look at compliance as a whole, okay, I'm not talking about PCI, GDPR, CCPA, PSD2. I'm talking overarching, okay? The methodology that we've developed, right, is that all compliance sets are based on three things, right? Policies, procedures, and control implementation. Okay, if you can hit those three pieces, you pretty much have every compliance regime across the board, except for the nuances.
Right.
Licked.
Right.
Now, mind you, that each compliance regime, right, each family, if you will, has their own way of writing a policy, or their own language for procedure, right, or their own way of doing audit controls, right?
Assessment controls.
Yeah,
assessment controls.
Well,
in this context,
assessment for PCI.
You're right.
Assessment for PCI, but audit controls for everything else.
Okay, potentially, yes.
So if you can hammer out those three pieces, you pretty much have them licked. You've done most of the work. Yeah. Now, we've run into companies that don't have any of those, right? We've run into companies that do it all, but they don't, they haven't written it down, right? So there are varying levels of what's out there and what companies are already doing that can hit various compliance regimes. Yep. Now, as far as the bleed over between PCI and GDPR, you all are right. We should be able to control the privacy of our data, right? Unfortunately, for the longest time, there have been data warehouses that have sold information, right?
Personal information.
Personal information.
They still do.
Oh, yeah, of course. Well, in this country, where we're just starting to see personal data protection with CCPA and things like that, but in other countries, GDPR is obviously the biggest example of it in Europe, where they're protecting and making you explicitly consent to your personal data collection and processing, et cetera, where they're explicitly making you consent to the sale or use of it by somebody else. Well, that kind of ruling is now opening up the avenue for citizens to have recourse.
I just want to know one thing. Am I going to get a coupon?
No, it's a chocolate bar. It's a chocolate bar.
That'll work.
People will sell their passwords for chocolate bars. That's a proven study.
They will.
Anyway, but I mean, it opens up the door for people to have recourse about their data. Right. So, for example,
in GDPR, if I may,
sure.
in GDPR, it's specifically written into the language that every single request must be looked at. Okay, so recently, as Josh is showing me right here on the computer, the Dutch are saying,
not a computer, that's a laptop.
The Dutch are saying that they're seeing a strong increase in privacy complaints.
This year, in the first 6 months of this year, they got 15,000 privacy complaints in the Netherlands alone. GDPR is people are going, this is interesting. I can complain?
Yeah.
Cool.
Right, but you look at what happens on the backside of complaints with companies being taken to court, right?
You've seen some big fines on GDPR this year.
The fines,
British Airways. I know, you're just starting to.
Yeah, you're just starting to. The problem is that what happened with Google, right? Google was fined something like $54 million under GDPR.
Come on, that's back.
Yeah, but that was that was before GDPR.
No, that was under GDPR.
No, it was before the full GDPR requirements were in place. This is why it's only $54 million.
True.
Because we covered that show. We covered that on the news show.
Otherwise, you might add a 0 or 2.
3 or 4.
But Marriott and British Airways were under GDPR requirements. And you saw those price tags move up, right? And that's what you're going to see. And so, yeah, you're seeing higher level of complaints. The other article we pulled in here, there's like 3 or 4 GDPR stories, is that companies vastly overestimating their GDPR readiness. Only 28% are achieving compliance. So not only do we see this major shift in how we're moving to privacy regulation, we're seeing an uptick in complaints, but we also know that companies are not ready for the GDPR requirements, which is going to play out in a series of lawsuits and fines and other things, I think, over time.
So to go along with the thread, right? You have to acknowledge every single complaint, right? So what would happen if I take a phone book, right, and I just scrape all the data out of the phone book and throw it in as each individual complaint, script it?
What's a phone book?
Really?
They have yellowpages.com.
I know what they
or
are.
whitepages.com.
Or whitepages.com.
Some of our listeners may not know what a phone book is.
A directory listing of all people in a state or a country or whatever.
Or in a geographic
area.
Does anybody print a phone book anymore?
Yeah, though they do.
Yeah, they do.
Really?
They still
they
give
do.
them out. I live in a city, and they still show up on my doorstep twice a year, and I go, God, I got to put that in recycling.
Right into recycling.
Yeah.
I think I finally
So
stopped
if I
getting
throw
it.
a phone book worth of data, right, you then have to spend resources, right, on hiring personnel, right, which means now you've got HR coming in, right? You've got to expend resources on building systems to accurately catalog all of this data. Okay, so now you've got system monies being spent, right? You've got training materials, so training budgets being spent, right? You've got the actual payroll for these people. Payroll is being spent, right? And then how does all of that come together, right? What it's really doing is it's eating away at the bottom line. Okay. So think of it as sort of distributed denial of money.
Okay.
Right? But it gets worse.
Well, in this case,
DDOM?
Well, distributed denial of money was when you used to used to donate money through like GoFundMe or PayPal or whatever, but it takes 2 cents to process a transaction, which the guy collecting money has to pay. If you donate a penny over and over and over again, you're actually draining money out of their bank account.
Right.
Okay?
Yeah.
You donate a penny, it costs them 2 cents to process. So what happens when you give a phone book, let's say I take 1 million names out of a directory and throw them at you and saying, these are all the people that have asked me to give you the privacy questions or right of erasure for them.
Because that is allowable under GDPR CCPA.
Okay.
So at that point, what you're doing is you're actually doing a distributed denial of compliance.
Yeah.
Interesting. So
Interesting.
A couple things.
The rabbit hole does go deeper than that.
Let's not go there yet.
Well,
but what we can do,
we got to save for future segments, guys.
but what we can talk about.
There's lots to talk about here. To recap and just to qualify a little bit, and I want to make a couple comments on the comparison to PCI and GDPR. But GDPR, in a nutshell, and correct me if I'm wrong, is identifying personal private data in your environment, your organization, more or less for the express purpose of letting the consumer, the owner, the person that the personal data is about, be able to come to you and say, I want you to lose it. I want you to
well, it's more than that. No,
that's not it.
It's to know that you have
one
it,
tiny piece of
how you're using it, the ability to be forgotten.
Right.
There's a number of components in GDPR.
And you're missing pieces too, which is that you have to start from the person. In other words, even to collect the data, I need your explicit permission.
Okay.
There are 6 exceptions to that, but I'm not going to get into that. This is way too
doesn't that mean
detailed.
an IP address is personal data?
In internal, let's assume that you have a company with people in it. I know, crazy thought.
Right.
And those people have computers that you've given them, and they have dynamic IP addresses. The dynamic IP addresses are personal data.
If they're uniquely identifiable to a person.
Which a DHCP server tells me it goes to this workstation that's uniquely identifiable.
To that
That's
person.
data that I'm not allowed to collect under GDPR.
Right.
Without explicit
permission.
consent.
So there's certainly
Now, there's ways to-
nuances and
please don't-
perhaps unintended
Consequences.
There's a lot of unintended consequences from a security perspective.
At a high level, the goal of GDPR is to allow the consumer to be as private as they want to be.
To be in control, yes and no. Realistically,
Control their
GDPR
destiny?
is to be in control of their own data,
Okay.
where that data goes, how that data is used, stored, collected, processed, sold, and that they should have knowledge of those things. If they choose to give it up, if they choose to enter into a relationship with you, if they choose to sell it, that's on them. But it gives them the power back, effectively, or it's supposed to.
So the correlation to PCI, because PCI, as we were talking about, is at some level, it's a framework for protecting
Cardholder data.
some type of data, and we were suggesting extend that to PII data,
right,
that's on the presumption that an organization has the permission or authorization
Correct.
or the buy-in from the consumer.
Yes.
You're allowed to collect my data, and
Because
then
I'm giving it
and
to
then the company is required to protect it.
Right.
Okay.
Correct.
And that's where the data security standard
Right.
could kick in.
Right.
Oh,
and then
absolutely.
if there's a breach
Absolutely.
of that data because you're not putting in the proper controls, that's when these potential fines from the EU Commission and other places can start to kick in. Yes, very unpleasant.
But that leads into our next article, which
Well,
is a great
hold on. I
Before
wanted
we
to
get to the
summarize
next
a couple
article.
things first.
Yeah, and I do too. I'll let Matt go first.
So I thought it was interesting to see which countries are meeting expectations and not, right?
Oh, good one.
Because GDPR is European-based, but it's for any EU citizen, right? So when you look at this graph, it's pretty interesting. Below the baseline of 28% are countries like Sweden, Italy, Spain, and France, okay? Which is interesting because they're all European countries. The U.S. is actually the highest, and they're outside of the EU when it comes to meeting the requirements of GDPR. So U.S. companies have actually taken GDPR pretty seriously from a fine perspective and are actually doing better than the European countries where this regulation was rooted in the first place.
How many
And
e-commerce
maybe
companies are based in the U.S.?
So many of these companies are already doing PCI.
Maybe. I don't know. But I thought that
companies in the U.S. are trained on certain compliance regimes that already incorporate pieces of privacy.
UK's at 33%, Germany's at 33%, Netherlands at 31%. Back to your Netherlands piece. They're all lower than the U.S., and these are all European countries. And UK has been a highly regulated country. Germany's and France have done. Yeah. So, I mean, you've got some highly regulated countries in the EU that are actually doing worse than the U.S., which I just thought was interesting in this article.
Well, I want to point out that, I mean, how many e-commerce companies are based in the U.S. that have either a German office?
If they're in the cloud, are they really based in the U.S.?
Technically, it's still based on your headquarters.
It depends on which cloud provider.
Oh, I'm going to hit you.
Right. Well, when you look at multi-cloud strategies, right? Which is like, so earlier we were talking with PCI about enveloping cloud into what's going on with the DSS, right?
Yep.
And the shared security model, right?
Yep.
But if you start bringing in multi-cloud models, right, where you have both AWS, Azure, and Google, right? As AWS is hot, Azure is warm, and Google is, oh God, we really need a backup, right?
Right.
It depends on.
We really need another strategy,
right? Or we really need another strategy, yet another strategy. When you're talking about multi-cloud models, right, and hosting of data, right, you have to get that information from the provider as to what servers and where your stuff is going to be hosted. So, for example, if you say, let's sign up for Azure, and you think that Azure is going to keep everything within the bounds of the U.S., but they have servers in Japan that handle load balancing much better than they do in the U.S., all of your data gets put in Japan. So what are you doing then? Are you claiming that you're still cordoned to the U.S. law, or now you cordoned to Japanese law?
So you're blowing my mind, because reality is the cloud is really servers that are on the ground somewhere.
The cloud is someone else's computer.
Right. We just both said the same thing, just to be clear.
Yep.
Yeah. So I was at the a central bank of the U.S., and I worked there. And
Were you in Kansas?
No, I was not, actually. I was in Philadelphia.
That's not central to the U.S.
Oh, shush.
I mean, it might as well be
central
Kansas.
to the East Coast, maybe.
But we actually evaluated Google services, and at the time, to do like a Google Suite, G Suite stuff. And we couldn't use it because we're like, where was our data going to be? And they're like, in a data center? We're like, great, where are the data centers? Like, everywhere? What is everywhere? Do you mean our data could be in China, France, Kansas, wherever? They're like, yes. Well, can we restrict it to a certain geography? Why would you do that? I don't know. Maybe because we're a bank and we're kind of tied to the government, and we want to restrict these things. Well, now they have those things. There's AWS GovCloud. There's Google for Government, I think it's called.
Right.
Things like that. So there's all these things that are out there now, but back then, no, it didn't happen.
Right.
Right. And if you're in Amazon now, right, so picking on Amazon for a second, it's very easy for you to say, okay, all of my servers are in US 1 East, right? Which is down in Sterling, right?
Ashburn,
Sterling, throwing
Virginia.
distance, Virginia. There's got 4 or 5 data centers down there, right?
No.
Versus putting stuff in Singapore or stuff in Ireland, right? Like Amazon has a way for you to be able to say only these servers in this location, done.
But the thing is, so now we're talking about, does data transferring through a server mean that it's under those laws? And that's let's keep that for another segment. This is a whole other
intercepting data in international water.
Let's go to Sealand. Yeah. All right.
Okay. Aren't there
you want to go PSD2, right?
Let's do PSD2.
So well, before that, so to wrap up, we've covered a couple GDPR articles in our discussion here. The original one, mapping PCI DSS to GDPR,
using it as a measuring stick.
I thought it was interesting because they started walking through the 12 requirements, but they only got through 9. And
everybody falls asleep by 9. Come on.
Well, it's a 12-step program.
It's a 12-step program, but I'm just curious as why they left out 10, 11, and 12. Just as
maybe they got to a length
comment.
limit and want to go to Article 2.
Maybe they edited it off, but and then their understanding, which I find very often there's a lot of misunderstanding about PCI that's presented in articles such as this, and this is one of them. And we won't go into the details, but it's not completely accurate in terms of its interpretation of PCI. Although I think at a macro level, doing the mapping or doing the how do we do with GDPR? Let's use
change
PCI
cardholder data
stick
to personal data.
The concept I think is sound. The content, the details of the article was kind of So we'll move. Now we can move on.
So we have some more articles, but the basics of the articles that we have left are really, honestly, about prepping and working with the different compliance regimes. In the Netherlands, they're complaining, their privacy complaints are going through the roof. In the executive suites, we're talking about how the chief compliance officers just simply don't have the tools. They need real-time monitoring, real-time observation tools in order to work with the GDPR, with PCI, with all the different compliance regimes that they're required to be under. We started talking about PSD2, which is actually a European banking system, a set of compliance and regulatory standards.
Didn't that just come out?
Well, it's actually not even out yet. It's out, but it's not enforced yet.
Correct.
Which requires every bank to open up their data, account information data, to third parties. Banks are being cut off from their customers. This is fascinating stuff. So now you've got, how is this going to affect me in PCI? Because you've got multiple now new ways to be breached. It's fascinating stuff. But realistically, we've got all these.
And we'll get into PSD2 on a later segment.
We're going to get into PSD2 on a later segment. So I think.
And I thought, as we think about GDPR and the articles we just covered, we've got CCPA coming next year, which is the first set of privacy requirements in the U.S. at a state level, actually with stronger requirements than GDPR.
To an extent, yeah. We're going to get into that later. Yeah,
right?
To an extent.
Which gets really interesting. And we still only see draft aspects of what's going to be there to comply with next year. So this article talks about the final version of the CCPA until next year, until they finish it, right? And so there's going to be a lot of interpretation around CCPA as it goes into effect in 2020.
But that was kind of what we went through with GDPR too. I mean, up until it executed,
every compliance regime.
There was a lot of anticipatory. Well, we think it's going to do this, so let's do that. But I remember being at RSA, I think 2 years ago, asking people about GDPR, and they're like, "It's not a thing yet. We're not worried about it." I'm like, that's actually a pretty sound approach.
And this is a great way to sort of end this out. Is that
except for I want to talk about one article.
Oh, please go ahead.
More, but go. Well, there was 2 articles, one of my stories, one of Matt's stories, that I think are somewhat related in terms of compliance in general. The article I had was when compliance isn't enough, which I think is going to be a theme that we touch on in this show frequently, is sort of the compare and contrast compliance to security. And then Matt's story about chief compliance officers needing real-time technology.
Well, that's what you mentioned. Yeah.
The article I had was basically it's a pitch for a company, but so we won't go into the details. But they were talking about this thing called integrated risk management as something new and different as opposed to governance, risk, and compliance.
So that's interesting because that actually is going back to what I was mentioning, which is that the interpretation of these compliance standards and the controls and the customizations, which we mentioned in PCI earlier, the ability of a company, of a law firm, of a compliance organization, such as the PCI Council, such as the GDPR Commission, I think it is, and so on and so forth.
Right.
And the insurance companies around all of these, not only the corporate cyber insurance, but the consulting firms' error and omission insurance, the compliance standard or compliance commission, if you will, a governing body, I think that's the proper term, the compliance governing bodies insurance around what they're doing and how they're going to be affected and how they're trying to pass that liability off, just as we were talking about with the PCI earlier.
Yep.
This is fascinating, and this is going to be, I think, a big part of what we talk about in days to come, because I think that the interpretation of these regulations is still something we're feeling our way through.
Yeah, and we've been doing it for 15 plus years. So some of the audience will know this fact and some won't. You know, I went from security to compliance in 03. And I had this really crazy idea is that can you manage compliance as this kind of ongoing real-time system monitoring ongoing stuff? And where it started was I had to manage 70,000 third-party vendors for one of the big national banks. You can't do that with Excel spreadsheets and people. It's just too hard.
Well, you can, but it's a lot of people.
It's a lot of people. It's a lot of work. And it's not efficient, right? And so we had this really crazy idea back then to build software. And what you're starting to see is the old GRC systems, the things that we created back in the early days. I'm talking 03, 04, 05, right? Were meant to do simple compliance kind of validation, right? Go back to the checkbox mentality.
Yep.
But some of us felt that there was a way to integrate data from other systems and get a better kind of real-time understanding assessment of where our risks were in the environment. And now what you've seen is this shift away from GRC to integrated risk management, which was always a vision a lot of the early GRC vendors had.
Yep.
It wasn't about a single compliance requirement. It was about how all those integrated components came together from a risk posture and manage risk, but it was dubbed GRC and over time got a bad rap. Now Gartner calls it integrated risk management, which ties into this article is if you're a chief compliance officer and you're multi-regulatory based and you're dealing with lots of third-party services and you're in a highly change environment because you're doing DevOps and all this stuff, how could you ever at any given day know where's the most critical risk to protect the organization? You can't.
Right.
It is so hard to manage all those variables.
Unfortunately, it comes down to like point in time snapshot. Where are you with things? What is the derivation from the previous snapshot? Right. So with most monitoring tools, you have to create a baseline first, right?
Yes.
Then tune the tool.
And then you have to monitor for that change.
Yeah.
And the problem with the early GRC products, which is why I think Gartner's come up with a new model, but all the GRC vendors are in it. And look, I have my own startup in the space, and I work for one of the other big boys in the space. They weren't architected.
No, they're not architected for continuous.
They're not architected for continuous input in these indicators coming into the environment. What you really need to see, if we're going to address integrated risk management, as Gartner calls it, and what chief compliance officers need is a whole new set of capabilities that do not exist today.
They do. They exist. They're just not put together in the right way. They're not put together. It's like I've got the pieces.
I still think there's a
jigsaw.
lot of pieces.
Oh yeah, agreed.
And they haven't been pulled together in a scalable system that can actually drive risk indicators to a chief compliance officer to go, oh wait, something just changed in the environment and I'm getting a red flag and I need to go address it.
There are products, people, consulting group services, etc., out there now that do pieces of this or large chunks of this. It is a rare group that has a coherent product or service that allows you to do continuous monitoring, bubble up your top risks to the top of the list, and properly stratify and tier those risks. Okay, let's be clear. And it is a rare group, product, service, whatever you want to call it, that can do all of these things on an ongoing basis. And here's the most important part: at a price point that the boards and the executives are willing to drop the cash on.
Yeah.
You know, and part of that, and I think that's the genesis of this show, perhaps, or maybe one of our goals, is the friction that exists between the boards need to answer certain compliance regulatory requirements just because, whereas their security people are saying, but no, we've got these other issues, we've got these other risks that you could argue are addressed or not addressed by the compliance, but they think those are more pressing. I am of the opinion, from putting my PCI hat on, that if you look at it at a high enough level, everything that the security people are concerned about is covered within the regulatory.
Yes.
Yeah, please drink.
If you do it right.
If you do it right.
If you do it right. And that's the call for the show is, what does that integration of security and compliance look like so that I'm doing the right things to protect data, but also meeting my regulatory requirements and being able to bring those together?
But adding into that the ability to talk to the board, the executives, the line managers, and the staff, the technologists, and have them agree on the risks, the prioritization of the risks, and all of those pieces that we've talked about in this sort of free-form engagement here.
And then coming from the other side of the coin is, how do you translate the ROI? Right? There's going to be a big expenditure, like we were saying just a couple minutes ago, but there's going to be a big expenditure that people are not ready for, right? How do you say that this is not a cost center, that this is actually protecting the business?
Right.
Or it could potentially even be a revenue center, which is something that we do.
Yep.
And it's difficult to make everybody understand. A big part of our job as Red Lion is actually translation between those different levels that we mentioned.
Yeah.
And it's fascinating, but that's a whole segment that we need to have later.
Well, and we're very passionate, and why we've pulled all of us together is because there's a lot to talk about here.
Oh my God.
So for now, we'll wrap this segment. This is episode 1. We've got it in the can now, and we don't have a formal way of exiting, but for now, we'll just say over and out.